I pressed the mop head against the kitchen tiles, the smell of bleach burning my nose. My back ached, and the clock on the microwave blinked 12:07 a.m. My daughter, Rachel, leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, scrolling on her phone as if I were the help she just hired. If you're watching this, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. She didn't say thank you. She didn't even glance at me. Instead, she muttered, "Don't miss the spot by the fridge." My knees dug into the floor, the same knees that had carried me through double shifts at the diner for 30 years. I was 55 years old, and here I was, scrubbing at midnight because my own daughter demanded it. I remember pausing, the mop dripping onto the tiles, thinking, when did love turn into servitude? I had always believed that keeping quiet, doing what was asked, and avoiding conflict meant I was keeping the family together. But in that moment, I realized all I was doing was erasing myself. When I finally stood, my back stiff, I caught Rachel's smirk. It wasn't just about the floors. It was about control. And something inside me shifted. I looked her in the eye and said, "Rachel, you won't be laughing when you see what's coming." Her smirk faltered for a second, just a flicker, but enough to give me strength. Because deep down, I already knew what I had to do. If that sounds harsh, here's how I got there. I couldn't sleep that night. Even after I put the mop away and crawled into bed, my hands kept shaking. I lay there in the dark, listening to the hum of the old air conditioner in my Tulsa duplex, feeling the ache in my joints and the heavier ache in my chest. I thought about every time I'd said yes when I should have said no. Every birthday where Rachel asked for something big, and I found a way to make it happen, even if it meant skipping my own bills. Every time she cut me off in conversation, and I just let her, thinking it wasn't worth the fight. See, I grew up believing silence was cheaper than conflict. My own mother used to tell me, "Carol, bite your tongue. Families stay together when women keep the peace." I carried that belief like a rule carved in stone. For years at the diner, I kept my head down, worked the shifts no one wanted, and told myself it was noble. At home, I swallowed my pride when Rachel's tone got sharp or when she dismissed my advice like I was outdated. But lying there after midnight, my body sore and my pride in tatters, I finally saw the cost of that silence. It wasn't peace I was buying, it was permission for her to keep treating me like I didn't matter. I thought about the little folder tucked in my nightstand. Inside were the papers that still had my name, the will I drafted a few years back, the bank account where my diner savings sat, and the deed to my modest duplex. I realized those were my last bits of power, and I had never once considered using them to set boundaries. The lesson was beginning to take shape, even though I couldn't put it into words just yet. Respect doesn't come from endless giving. Respect comes from lines you don't let people cross. But it didn't start that night. It started months earlier. I guess to really understand how I ended up mopping floors at midnight for my own daughter, you need to know where Rachel and I came from. I had her young, 26, and back then I was working 6 days a week at Mel's Diner on the east side of Tulsa. The kind of place where truckers parked their rigs out front, and families came in after Friday night football games. I spent most of her childhood in an apron that smelled like coffee and grease. Rachel used to sit in a booth after school, coloring in menus while I ran plates. She grew up watching me hustle, though I don't think she ever really understood the sacrifices behind it. Her dad, Eddie, was gone by the time she was 8. He was charming, I'll give him that, but he couldn't hold down a job to save his life. When he left, I promised myself I'd carry the weight for Rachel. I never wanted her to feel the instability I had felt as a kid, bouncing between my mom's apartment and my grandparents' house. So I overcompensated. I bought her things I couldn't afford, backpacks with name brands when her classmates had knockoffs, dance lessons that ate into my rent budget. I told myself it was worth it, that I was investing in her happiness. Looking back now, I can see how I planted the seeds. Every time I said yes when I should have said no, Rachel learned that I would bend, stretch, and break to give her what she wanted. By the time she hit her 20s, she had grown into someone sharp and ambitious but also entitled. She worked part-time, floated between apartments, and when things got tough, she always had a place back at my house. I told myself that was normal, that helping your kid get on their feet was what mothers did. But things shifted a couple years ago. Rachel landed an office job downtown with a health benefits package and a steady paycheck. You'd think that would have made her more independent, but instead, she seemed to grow bolder in her demands. "Mom, pay this bill until I get reimbursed," or "Mom, you should help with my car payment since you drive it sometimes." The first object I saved during that time was a receipt, actually, a set of them. I started keeping receipts whenever I bailed her out. I'd tuck them into a yellow folder and mark the month in red ink. December, January, March. I told myself it was just for my own records, but a small part of me knew it might matter someday. The second thing I kept was an email. Rachel had used my name on a furniture store application, trying to get financing for a new sofa. The store manager caught it and called me to verify. I almost fainted when I realized she had signed my name electronically without even telling me. I printed that email and slipped it into the folder too. And then there was the third piece, a little spiral notebook I carried in my purse. I used it for jotting down diner orders back in the day, but I repurposed it. Anytime Rachel asked for money, I wrote it down. Date, amount, reason. I never told her about the notebook. It became my secret ledger, proof that I wasn't crazy when I felt drained. At the time, I thought I was just coping. I wasn't planning anything yet. I still clung to the belief that she'd grow out of it, that she'd mature and recognize the ways I had supported her. But the truth? Every scribble in that notebook was a bruise I didn't let heal. The turning point came one Sunday afternoon. Rachel came over, dropped her purse on the counter, and asked me to clean her apartment while she was away on a work trip. Just like that, as if I were her maid. I laughed it off at first, but then she got serious. She told me her coworkers had house cleaners and it was normal. Something inside me snapped that day. I didn't argue, but later that night, I took out my folder, spread the receipts and notes across the table, and realized I had a history. A paper trail. And with it, maybe a little bit of leverage. Which brings me to the plan I should have made sooner. The breaking point came in Naperville, Illinois, when I moved closer to Rachel after retiring. She'd convinced me it was the perfect place to start fresh. What she really meant was it was the perfect place for her to keep me close and useful. Her husband, Greg, welcomed me at first. Greg was 35, polished in his pressed suits, always with a Bluetooth in his ear. He had the confidence of a man who thought he was untouchable. At dinners, he'd talk about deals closing and returns compounding, as if he were building empires. But it didn't take long before I noticed cracks. He had a temper, mostly hidden, but it surfaced in the way he corrected Rachel or the sharpness in his voice when neighbors asked too many questions. Then came the night I confronted him. I discovered withdrawals from a shared account Rachel thought was untouchable, the one holding part of her inheritance from Eddie's insurance payout. Greg was dipping into it for business expenses. When I raised the issue, his eyes narrowed, and he leaned across the table with a smirk that chilled me. "You're finished, Carol," he said flatly, like he was swatting a fly. "This isn't your business. Stay out of it." Finished. The word rang in my ears long after I left their house. I'd spent my whole life keeping the peace, swallowing hard words, bending until my spine ached. But that night, I realized something I hadn't let myself believe before: keeping quiet had never protected me. It had only made me invisible. I went home, pulled out the yellow folder and the spiral notebook from my suitcase, and spread them across the dining table in my duplex. Receipts, emails, notes, all of it painted a picture of a man misusing funds and a daughter too blind or too scared to stop him. That's when the plan began to form. I didn't need to fight Greg with raised voices. I didn't need to match his arrogance or win Rachel's sympathy. I needed to use the same rules he thought he had mastered. Paperwork. Contracts. Notices. The language of systems that couldn't be argued with. First, I began with small claims filings. Nothing grand, nothing that screamed war. Just quiet moves, a reimbursement dispute here, a breach of agreement there. Each one left a trace, a record Greg couldn't erase. Then I looked into the HOA bylaws for Rachel's neighborhood. Greg prided himself on their perfect home and manicured lawn, but he had ignored minor violations, trash bins out too long, noise complaints from late-night phone calls on the patio. I collected evidence and filed notices. Every envelope that arrived chipped away at his facade of control. It wasn't just about money. It was about proving to him that I wasn't finished, not by a long shot. But as I laid out my plan, I also understood the stakes. This wasn't just about me. Rachel's inheritance, her stability, her future, it was all tangled in Greg's hands. And if I failed, if I pushed too hard, I risked not only alienating my daughter but also watching everything she had disappear under his reckless ambition. That fear burned hot in my chest, but the resolve was stronger. I thought back to every long shift at the diner, every sacrifice, every time I chose silence over self-respect. I had earned the right to draw the line. I promised myself then, Greg would regret underestimating me. And this time, I wasn't going to stay quiet. The first complication arrived sooner than I expected. I had just filed my first small claims case, a modest reimbursement for funds Greg had taken under the guise of business expenses, when a thick envelope showed up in my own mailbox. At first, I thought it was another HOA newsletter, but the words "notice of lien" in bold black letters made my stomach drop. Apparently, Greg had arranged for some joint liability transfer tied to Rachel's car loan, a loan he had refinanced without telling her. And somehow, my name had been dragged into the paperwork as a secondary guarantor. My savings, my modest duplex, even my credit, suddenly, all of it felt exposed. I sat at the kitchen table with the notice in one hand and my spiral notebook in the other. My fingers trembled, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. This wasn't a mistake. This was a move. Greg was letting me know he saw my filings, and he wasn't afraid to retaliate. I could have backed down right then. Years ago, I would have. But not now. I remembered the smirk on his face, the word "finished," and I knew stepping back would only tighten the noose. So I doubled down. The next move was the HOA. Greg prided himself on maintaining an image of suburban perfection. Their cul-de-sac in Naperville was full of trimmed hedges, American flags, and neighbors who waved while secretly tallying every violation. Greg liked to talk big about how respected he was on the block. But the truth was, he'd slipped. I had photos, trash cans left at the curb for 3 days, Rachel's car leaking oil on the pristine concrete, noise complaints logged by neighbors when Greg's late-night calls ran past midnight. I filed each violation formally, citing exact bylaws. Within weeks, their mailbox was heavy with HOA warnings. Rachel looked confused, flustered even, but Greg's jaw tightened each time another letter arrived. He knew. He just didn't know how much I had documented. Then came the social backlash. Naperville wasn't a place where scandals stayed hidden for long. Whispers started. I'd overhear them at the grocery store, see it in the way Mrs. Alvarez down the block stopped waving when she saw Rachel walking the dog. People were talking about Greg's money management, or lack of it. The neighbors didn't need the full story. A hint of financial missteps was enough to stain his reputation. Rachel, of course, didn't take it well. She accused me of stirring things up and embarrassing her. That hurt more than I'll admit. But every time I thought about giving in, I remembered the inheritance she didn't even realize was at risk. Greg, meanwhile, started circling like a hawk. He'd show up at my duplex under the pretense of talking things out. He was slick about it, never outright threatening, but his words carried weight. "You're not playing in your league, Carol," he'd say, standing in my doorway with that forced smile. "I know people. You don't want to get hurt by accident." He wanted me rattled. But he didn't understand. I had lived through nights of counting pennies, of wondering how to stretch tips into rent. Fear wasn't new to me. Still, the complications kept coming. The lien was only the start. When I checked my credit report, I found inquiries I hadn't authorized. Greg had tried to dig deeper, perhaps looking for weaknesses. Then Rachel stopped calling me for a few weeks, clearly caught between her husband's fury and her mother's stubbornness. That silence stung worse than the notices. But it also hardened me. I went back to my yellow folder. Each receipt, each email, each note was like a weapon I had sharpened without realizing. I organized them chronologically, highlighting discrepancies, matching dates with account withdrawals. The picture was becoming clearer. Greg wasn't just careless, he was funneling money into personal side projects, hiding behind vague terms like investment opportunities. The deeper I dug, the more I uncovered. One email chain hinted at a failed deal with a local contractor. Another showed him inflating invoices and pocketing the difference. The inheritance wasn't just being borrowed, it was being siphoned. Every new discovery fueled me, even as the complications stacked higher. The real turning point in the complications came when the neighbors began asking me questions directly. At a block barbecue, Mrs. Alvarez leaned in and whispered, "Carol, is it true Greg's been moving money around?" My husband heard from the HOA treasurer. I froze with a paper plate in my hand. I hadn't expected it to travel this far, this fast. Gossip was a double-edged sword. It weakened Greg's reputation, yes, but it also risked making Rachel feel cornered, humiliated. That night, Rachel showed up at my door. She didn't knock gently, she stormed in, eyes blazing. "Are you enjoying this?" she demanded. "Do you like watching us struggle?" Her words cut deep, but I stayed calm. I told her I wasn't against her, that everything I did was to protect her from losing what was hers. She didn't believe me, at least not yet. Behind her, I saw Greg leaning against the car, arms folded, watching through the window. His smirk was gone. His eyes were colder now, calculating. That was when I knew the battle wasn't just legal anymore. It was personal. And the complications? They weren't setbacks. They were steps toward something Greg didn't see coming. Because while he was busy trying to intimidate me, I had the one thing he never expected from someone like me, proof. The night I found the receipts was the night everything changed. I wasn't digging for new evidence. I was just organizing the chaos on my dining table, my yellow folder spread open, notebook beside it, HOA notices stacked neatly in the corner. That's when I noticed the slip of paper wedged between two old electric bills. A receipt from a downtown hotel. At first, I thought it was nothing, maybe a client meeting or one of Greg's late-night business dinners. But the date caught me. It matched the same week he had told Rachel he was in Milwaukee for 3 days. A chill ran through me. I kept reading. More receipts surfaced, each tied to strange expenses, electronics purchased in cash, restaurant bills for two when he claimed to be traveling alone, office supplies from vendors Rachel had never heard of. And then the emails. I had already printed a few chains, but I dug deeper into the copies I'd pulled from Rachel's shared computer. Buried in those threads were invoices, doctored invoices. Greg was inflating numbers, creating fake expenses, and using Rachel's inheritance account as his private piggy bank. For weeks, I'd been pushing paper like a chess player moving pawns, hoping to corner him. Now, staring at those receipts and emails, I realized I wasn't just defending myself. I was holding a weapon that could take him down completely. This wasn't about minor violations or quiet filings anymore. This was fraud. And with fraud came leverage. The shift wasn't just in what I had, it was in me. For so long, I had felt like I was playing catch-up, reacting to Greg's moves, always one step behind his confidence and Rachel's blind loyalty. But that night, as I spread those documents across the table, something clicked. I didn't feel like prey anymore. I felt like a hunter. Greg's power wasn't in his intelligence. It was in his ability to convince people he couldn't be challenged. He thrived on intimidation, secrecy, and the silence of others. And here I was, armed with the truth, with a paper trail that spoke louder than his threats ever could. For the first time since this all began, I saw the possibility of winning. Not just surviving, not just slowing him down, but exposing him, stripping away the mask he wore so proudly. The very next day, I tested the waters. I filed another notice, this one tied directly to an inflated invoice I could prove false. Small enough to stay under the radar, but strong enough to shake him. Sure enough, Greg showed up at my door that evening, tighter-lipped than usual. He didn't smile this time. "You think you're clever?" he asked, leaning in close enough that I could smell his cologne. "Paper won't save you. You're out of your depth." But his eyes betrayed him. He wasn't calm anymore. He was rattled. I didn't flinch. I simply said, "You should be more careful with your receipts." The color drained from his face, just for a moment. Then he stormed off without another word. That was the shift. That was the moment I knew I'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Of course, power shifts come with risk. The gossip around Naperville was spreading faster, Rachel was growing more defensive, and the lean still loomed over me like a storm cloud. But none of that mattered as much now. Because for the first time, I wasn't just reacting, I was leading. I had proof. I had patience. And most importantly, I had nothing left to lose. Greg thought he could declare me finished. He didn't realize he just opened the door for me to begin. I walked into the Chase branch on Main Street at 9:12 a.m. with a manila envelope and my notebook folded tight in my hand. "Good morning, ma'am, ID and signature, please," the teller said, polite and brisk. I handed over a printed bank statement with highlighted withdrawals, $1, $245.67 here, $3, $800 there, and a certified mail receipt I needed to cash proof. The teller stamped my copy and slid it back with a small, sympathetic smile. "You'll want to keep all those," she said. I did. I kept every one. Bank 9:12 a.m. was the first micro scene of the day. I closed the account tied to Rachel's inheritance funds and requested a trace on several suspicious withdrawals. The woman at the counter made a few clicks and muttered a reference number that I wrote down, Trace ID 1427. Numbers were my new language, Trace ID 1427, receipt total $1, $245.67, lien notice amount $4, $200. They were not just digits, they were proof. County Clerk 3:40 p.m. found me at the DuPage County Clerk's office, standing in a long line with a stack of forms. I handed the clerk a packet, small claims filing, copies of invoices, the printouts of doctored receipts, and the certified mail return cards that showed Greg had received notice. "This will be filed as of today," she said, stamping the packet and handing me a docket number. I wrote it down in my spiral notebook, docket 2025 C0983, and felt something inside me settle. I moved in micro scenes like that all week. I mailed certified notices from the post office, those yellow slips that let you see when someone actually opens an envelope. I sat in the HOA office across from a woman named Denise, who shook her head as she read the photographs I'd taken of trash cans left out for 3 days and the oil stain on Rachel's driveway. "We'll schedule a hearing," she said, tapping at a clipboard. "Violation Code 6B covers that." That line, Violation Code 6B, became another small, satisfying tool in my belt. I did routine things over and over, copying documents, notarizing affidavits, making phone calls, and walking to the courthouse to check the civil filings board. I drove back and forth to Greg and Rachel's cul-de-sac, leaving envelopes that required signatures, and I kept a steady, soft rhythm to the work. I cross-checked every date, matched receipts to account statements, and organized everything in chronological order. The montage of it was simple and steady. I printed, I copied, I mailed, I waited. At one point I sat across from a mediator at a small legal clinic downtown. "We can draft a demand letter that outlines the misallocated funds and request repayment within 30 days, she said, tapping a template. I asked for the exact legal language and added a paragraph about the HOA violations. It felt almost surgical, clear, precise, unemotional. There was a human exchange I will never forget. I met with the contractor who'd sent the inflated invoices Greg had been using. He was an older man, 40-ish, with a ledger he kept in a battered trucker's notebook. I slid an invoice across the diner table, $3,800 listed as roof repairs, and asked him, quietly, "Did you actually do that work?" He looked at the dates, his brow tightened, and he said, "No, I didn't. I billed him, but I didn't do half of that." His voice was small, embarrassed. He promised payment up front and never cleared it. That admission was a hinge. It linked invoice to account to the inheritance fund. I filed small claims suits where appropriate, reimbursement claims under state small claims limits, each one accompanied by copies of receipts and a sworn affidavit. I filed a notice with the HOA, pushing for fines that would create an administrative record. I submitted a complaint to the bank's fraud department with Trace ID 1427 attached. I requested a public records search through the county recorder's office to track any transfers tied to Greg's name. Every step left a paper trail: certified mail numbers, docket numbers, Trace ID 1427, docket 2025C0983. People started to notice the paperwork more than the person behind it. Denise from the HOA called me back and said, "We've scheduled an enforcement hearing for next Tuesday." The county clerk's office emailed a confirmation of the small claims date. The bank gave me a case number and a tentative date for a meeting with their fraud investigator. Those confirmations felt like small lights coming on in a dark room. I wanted the process to be boring and bureaucratic, inescapable in its dullness. I wanted the law and the rules to move, slowly and predictably, like the tide. I wanted evidence, procedure, and time to strip away his swagger. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The day of the small claims hearing felt like victory before it even started. I stood in the hallway outside courtroom 2B with my neat binder, every tab color-coded, blue for bank statements, yellow for receipts, green for HOA notices. Greg strolled in 15 minutes late, tieless, smirking like he owned the room. He didn't. Inside, the judge flipped through my exhibits, lips pursed. "Mrs. Green, you've provided receipts, certified mail records, and a notarized affidavit from the contractor?" "Yes, Your Honor." My voice didn't even shake. The judge turned to Greg. "Mr. Harris, do you have documentation?" Greg shrugged. "Those numbers are exaggerated, but family expenses are complicated." When the gavel fell, the judge ordered restitution for part of the inheritance funds and set a compliance date. I walked out feeling taller than I had in years. Neighbors in the hallway whispered, little ripples of validation. For the first time in decades, I felt heard. Back home that night, I poured myself a glass of iced tea and flipped open my binder again, savoring the stamped docket pages. I thought, finally, this nightmare is over. But victory has a way of luring you into complacency. 2 weeks later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. Thick paper, return address from a law firm downtown. Inside was a lien notice, filed against my duplex. My chest went cold. Greg had counterfiled, claiming unpaid loans he supposedly extended to me over the years. He attached doctored Venmo screenshots, dates that didn't even make sense. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the bold black letters, notice of lien, amount $4,200. My hand went numb holding the page. All that confidence from court evaporated in an instant. Then came the neighbors. At the next HOA meeting, Denise cleared her throat and said, "We've had some concerns raised about family disputes becoming public." People glanced at me like I was the problem, not the woman trying to clean up a mess. Greg, of course, had been whispering his side of the story around the cul-de-sac, that I was bitter, unstable, trying to ruin him. I felt it in the grocery store, too. I walked down the cereal aisle at Jewel Osco and heard hushed voices behind me. "That's her," someone muttered. I gripped my cart tighter, head down. My little blue binder suddenly felt less like armor and more like a target. The backlash seeped into places I hadn't expected. Rachel, my own daughter, called me late one night. Her voice was sharp. "Mom, do you have to make everything so dramatic? Greg says you're dragging our names through the mud. Do you even care what this does to me at work?" I swallowed hard. "Rachel, he took your inheritance money. I'm trying to protect what's yours." She sighed, heavy and tired. I don't want to be in the middle." That was the knife twist, realizing my fight for her future was making her resent me. I hung up, staring at the quiet walls of my duplex, wondering if maybe silence would have been easier after all. For a few days, I moved like a ghost. The lien hung over me, threatening my home. The neighbors eyed me like I was stirring up trouble. Rachel's coldness cut deeper than any courtroom order. My body felt heavy, my chest tight with the thought that maybe I'd gone too far. But then, one night, flipping through the binder for the 100th time, I noticed something I hadn't before. A line item buried in the contractor's ledger, a duplicate invoice number, same date, different totals. The handwriting note beside it said paid by GH. My pulse quickened. GH, Greg Harris. It wasn't over. Until one line in an old message changed everything. I sat at my kitchen table with the binder cracked open, that duplicate invoice staring back at me. My tea had gone cold hours ago, but I didn't care. The contractor's ledger had 2 entries for the same date, one billed to me, one marked paid by GH. At first, I thought it was just sloppy bookkeeping. But then I remembered the email chain I'd tucked into the back pocket of the binder. I pulled it out, smoothing the pages with trembling hands. The contractor had written, "Greg, I still need the second half of payment before I can finish." The timestamp matched the ledger date. Greg wasn't just inflating invoices. He was rerouting payments, using Rachel's inheritance money to cover his own debts, then forging numbers to hide the trail. The evidence wasn't circumstantial anymore. It was black and white, in receipts and emails, with his initials on them. I flipped through more files and saw the pattern clear as day. Transfers from the joint account lining up with invoices that never matched the work done. Emails where Greg promised personal bonuses if jobs were rushed. Even a Venmo receipt he'd submitted as proof of loans to me, it was actually a payment to a landscaping crew for his buddy's rental property. My stomach turned, but alongside the disgust was a spark, sharp and electric. For weeks, he'd painted me as the bitter mother-in-law, desperate and meddling. But here, in black ink and digital timestamps, was proof of deliberate mismanagement. Proof that could pierce through his smug smile and his lies to Rachel and the neighbors. I sat back, binder heavy in my lap, and whispered to the empty room, "Got you." It wasn't about revenge anymore, not really. It was about truth. And truth has a way of cutting cleaner than any rumor. Now I knew exactly where to stand. The next morning, I woke up with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. The sun was just creeping over the tops of the maple trees outside my duplex, and for once, the knot in my chest wasn't dread, it was resolve. I gathered the binder, tucked the contractor's ledger copy into a clear sleeve, and drove to the county clerk's office. The parking lot was half empty, still wet from last night's rain. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed as I handed my packet across the counter. "This is supplemental evidence for case number 2025C0983, I said. The clerk glanced at the stack. "Emails and receipts?" I nodded. "All tied to financial mismanagement by the defendant." She stamped the cover page, slid me back a copy, and gave me a small nod. "This strengthens your case." That stamp felt like thunder in my chest. 3 days later, at the small claims continuation, Greg looked less smug. He still showed up late, still wore that practiced air of indifference, but when the judge flipped through the binder, his jaw tightened. "Mr. Harris," the judge said slowly, tapping the duplicate invoices, "can you explain why the same job number is listed twice, once as paid by you, once as billed to Mrs. Green?" Greg shifted. "Accounting error." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Then why does this email reference an unfinished payment on that same date?" For the first time, Greg stuttered. His words tangled into excuses about contractors and side jobs. I watched him scramble, the confidence draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. The judge's ruling was firm. Greg owed restitution in full. A formal order to repay the misused funds. And that lien he'd slapped on my duplex? Vacated, declared fraudulent. The gavel cracked like a clean break, and I nearly sagged with relief. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. After the hearing, I filed a complaint with the State Licensing Board for Contractors, attaching the invoices and the contractor's own affidavit. I didn't need Greg barred from every future job, but I wanted the paper trail to live outside our family mess. His record would speak for itself, long after this case was done. Next, I sent a certified letter to the HOA board, enclosing copies of the falsified receipts and court ruling. Denise read them aloud at the monthly meeting, her voice steady, per violation code 6B, and pursuant to restitution order 2025C0983, Mr. Harris is subject to immediate fines and property compliance checks. The neighbors, who'd once whispered about me in grocery aisles, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their eyes didn't cut at me anymore. They cut at him. It was like watching the tide turn, slow but unstoppable. The real moment came at Rachel's. She invited me over for Sunday dinner, her voice flat on the phone. When I arrived, Greg barely looked at me. He sat stiffly at the table, jaw set, while Rachel served roast chicken and mashed potatoes like nothing was wrong. Halfway through the meal, I pulled the binder from my bag and slid it onto the table. "Rachel," I said quietly, "you need to see this." She hesitated, fork hovering. Greg muttered, "Don't start," but I held her gaze. Slowly, she opened the binder. Her eyes moved over the highlighted receipts, the emails with Greg's name, the court stamp vacating the lien. Her face went pale. "Greg, what is this?" He shifted in his chair, tried to laugh it off. "Babe, it's just paperwork." She's twisting things. Rachel's hand shook as she flipped another page. "Twisting? This is your email. This is your Venmo. You told me Mom was exaggerating." Silence hung heavy. Finally, she whispered, "you lied to me." Greg pushed back his chair, muttering excuses, but Rachel didn't look at him. She just closed the binder slowly and whispered, "Get out." For the first time, the fight wasn't between me and Greg. It was between him and the truth. In the weeks that followed, the effects spread like ripples. Greg's restitution payments came in installments, each check stamped by the court clerk. The lien was scrubbed from my property record, the official notice mailed to me in crisp black ink. The HOA levied fines that stacked higher than his pride could cover. And the neighbors? They stopped whispering. At the next HOA barbecue, one woman clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You stuck to the rules. Good for you." I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The revenge wasn't fire or fury. It was paper, receipts, emails, court orders, certified letters. Each one stripped Greg's story bare until only the facts remained. And as I sat on my porch one evening, binder closed at last, I realized something. The real victory wasn't in watching Greg stumble. It was in knowing I'd reclaimed my voice, my boundaries, and my dignity, all without raising it above a whisper. Then came the calls. The fallout came in waves, each one reshaping the ground beneath us. At first, it was Greg's career. Word of the court ruling spread faster than either of us expected. Contractors talk, and so do neighbors. By the end of the month, the state licensing board had flagged his business for review. Jobs he'd lined up were suddenly postponed. Calls went unanswered. A friend of his, one who had vouched for him at the HOA, quietly dropped his name from their company's website. The career he'd built on fast talk and falsified numbers was stalling in real time. Rachel bore the brunt of his collapse. At first, she defended him. "He just made mistakes, Mom. Everyone does." But as the restitution checks kept draining their joint account, and the HOA fines stacked like unpaid parking tickets, her tone changed. I could hear it in her voice on the phone, that weary edge of someone carrying too much. One evening, she came over to my duplex alone. She looked older, her shoulders sagging, her face pale. "Mom," she whispered, clutching a mug of tea like it was the only thing keeping her steady, "I don't even know who I married." "I didn't say, I warned you." I just reached across the table, squeezed her hand, and let her talk. The neighborhood shifted too. Those who once rolled their eyes when I walked past were suddenly warm, some even apologetic. Denise from the HOA stopped by with a pie, muttering, "You were right to call it out." I wasn't looking for validation, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel good. For years, I'd been the quiet one, the pushover. Now, they saw me as something else, a woman who'd stood her ground. Still, revenge has a strange taste. Sweet, yes, but with a bitter afterbite. The bitterness came in the form of loneliness. Rachel's marriage was crumbling, and though I knew it wasn't my fault, I couldn't shake the guilt. Watching my daughter wrestle with betrayal cut deeper than any slight Greg had thrown at me. And yet, I reminded myself, protecting her future was worth it. Boundaries sometimes come with bruises, but they also guard against deeper wounds. Greg didn't disappear quietly. For weeks, he prowled the edges of my life, snide emails, vague posts online about meddling in-laws, even a half-hearted attempt to rally neighbors on his side. But the evidence was too heavy, too undeniable. Each time he tried to rewrite the story, the stamped court orders and receipts told the truth louder. Eventually, even his defiance cracked. One night, Rachel called to say he'd packed a bag and left. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. I felt a pang of sorrow for her, for the years she'd invested in someone who cared more about control than trust. But I also felt relief. For both of us. The biggest consequence wasn't his downfall, though. It was mine, my transformation. I realized, standing in the quiet of my living room one evening, that I was no longer afraid of conflict. Setting boundaries didn't destroy me. It saved me. Silence had been my shield for so long, but all it ever did was make me smaller. Now, my voice, steady, factual, unyielding, was my shield. Neighbors respected me. Rachel leaned on me. Even strangers at the courthouse treated me like someone who mattered. Because I had mattered all along, I just hadn't believed it until now. One afternoon, as I filed away the last of the restitution paperwork, I caught my reflection in the glass of the cabinet. I didn't see a bitter mother-in-law or a retired nurse past her prime. I saw a woman who had drawn a line, held it, and stood taller because of it. Greg's reputation was in tatters, his career stalled, and Rachel's future protected. But the real consequence, the one that mattered most, was the one I carried inside. I had learned the power of no, and once spoken, it echoed louder than any whisper of tolerance I had clung to before. The fallout wasn't easy. It wasn't clean. But it was necessary. And as the dust settled, I knew this wasn't just a story about revenge. It was a story about reclaiming myself. Just when I thought the dust had settled, life found one more way to test me. It was early spring, about 3 months after Greg had left town. Rachel was slowly piecing herself back together, therapy, new routines, dinners with me that didn't end in tears. I had started sleeping again, finally able to enjoy small pleasures, tending to my potted geraniums, baking lemon bread, reading mystery novels without my mind drifting back to court filings. Then, a letter came. The envelope was thick, stamped with the seal of a Chicago law firm. For a moment, my heart dropped. My first thought, Greg's found another way to come after us. I opened it slowly, bracing for another round of accusations or appeals. But what I found was stranger, and, in its own way, more dangerous. The letter explained that Greg had been tied to a separate investment venture, one where multiple homeowners had put in money for property improvements that never materialized. The firm represented several of those homeowners, and my name had come up because of my testimony in court. Apparently, Greg hadn't just misused Rachel's inheritance. He'd been playing a bigger game all along, siphoning funds from multiple families in the neighborhood under the guise of fast-track renovations. At first, I felt the old fear creeping back. My mind went to Rachel, how this would devastate her all over again, how she might feel complicit just by being married to him. But then, something shifted. For once, I wasn't at the mercy of his games. This time, I had leverage. I called the firm the next morning, binder open in front of me. I have documents, emails, receipts, even a contractor affidavit, I told them. If Greg defrauded others, you'll find the same patterns in my evidence. There was a pause on the other end, then a firm, Mrs. Green, that could make you the key witness. That was the first twist, realizing Greg's mismanagement wasn't personal. It was systemic. He hadn't just tried to cheat me, he'd built an entire house of cards, and now it was starting to collapse. The second twist came later. One afternoon, Rachel came by with a worn shoebox in her hands. I was cleaning the closet, she said, her voice shaky. I found this. Inside were Greg's old receipts, stubs, and scribbled notes, most of them trash. But tucked in the bottom was a single folded sheet of paper, a private agreement between Greg and Rachel, written just after their wedding. It was a contract, of sorts. Greg had convinced her to sign a marital financial agreement, giving him sole management rights over certain assets she inherited from her grandmother. He had dressed it up like protection, so creditors can't touch it if anything happens to me, but in reality, it gave him legal control over thousands of dollars Rachel hadn't even realized she'd signed away. She sat across from me, tears in her eyes, clutching the paper. Mom, I didn't even remember signing this. I thought it was just paperwork for taxes. That was the second twist. Rachel hadn't just been deceived by omission, she had been trapped by Greg's manipulation from the start. I felt fury rise in me again, hotter than before. But alongside it was something steadier, resolve. "We'll fix this," I told her. "We'll show the court how he cornered you. This agreement won't stand once they see the fraud tied to it." Rachel's hand trembled, but she nodded. In the weeks that followed, the law firm took my evidence and began weaving it into a larger case. Greg, wherever he was hiding, suddenly had more than me to answer to. Families he'd cheated, neighbors he'd lied to, even the state board now circling like hawks. And Rachel? She filed a motion to void the marital agreement, citing fraud and coercion. For the first time, she wasn't just leaning on me, she was standing beside me. Together, we walked into the clerk's office, shoulder to shoulder, a united front. That was the true double twist. The revenge I thought was mine alone had rippled outward, empowering Rachel too. She wasn't just my daughter anymore, she was a woman reclaiming her voice, just as I had. Looking back, the irony isn't lost on me. Greg thought he could silence me with intimidation, then silence Rachel with legal trickery. But in trying to take everything, he gave us both something more valuable, the courage to stop being silent. The binder that had once been my weapon became ours. And as the lawyers built their case and Rachel tore up that agreement in my kitchen, I knew we weren't just cleaning up after him anymore. We were free. And Greg? Well, his downfall wasn't a single gavel strike, it was a series of cracks, spreading wider until the whole facade caved in. If you'd asked me a year ago what mattered most in family, I would have said harmony. Keeping the peace. Smiling through disrespect, biting my tongue when the hurt cut deep, telling myself that silence was the glue that held us together. But here's what I know now, silence doesn't protect love. It protects abuse. It protects manipulation. It protects people like Greg. The real glue, the thing that binds families, friendships, even communities, is respect. And respect only grows where boundaries are honored. For decades, I believed setting boundaries meant risking love. I thought that if I said no, if I pushed back, I'd drive people away. That's why I let Rachel talk over me, why I let neighbors dismiss me, why I let Greg twist the truth until I felt small in my own home. But when I finally drew a line, when I used the law, the paperwork, the evidence, I didn't lose myself. I found myself. And something else happened too. Rachel, who had grown up watching me swallow my words, finally saw me stand tall. She watched me fight, not with shouting, not with cruelty, but with clarity and truth. And in that reflection, she found her own strength. That's the hidden beauty of boundaries, they don't just protect you. They give permission to others to protect themselves. Revenge wasn't the lesson, though I won't pretend it didn't feel cathartic to watch Greg unravel. The lesson was that truth doesn't need to be shouted. It needs to be shown, documented, held firm. I didn't beat him with rage, I beat him with receipts, emails, and the courage to say, enough. Now, when I think about the future, I don't imagine keeping the peace at any cost. I imagine living with dignity, with respect, with the confidence to speak when something isn't right. And if Rachel carries even a piece of that forward, then everything, the hearings, the whispers, the long nights at my kitchen table, was worth it. Because silence may seem easier in the moment, but boundaries are what build lasting peace. Section 14, Closing Image and CTA, 300 to 500 words. I stood in my kitchen again, the same place where months earlier I'd scrubbed floors at midnight, humiliated and too tired to cry. Only this time, the lights glowed softer, calmer. The mop leaned against the corner, untouched, and my hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea instead of a bucket of dirty water. The house felt different. Not because the walls had changed, but because I had. Every shadow that used to stretch across this room carried Greg's voice, Rachel's demands, my own silence. Now, those shadows felt like proof of battle survived. I looked at the table where I had spread out invoices and receipts like weapons. I remembered the shaking in my hands when I mailed that first certified letter, the dread that maybe I'd gone too far. And then I remembered the strength that came later, the kind that didn't roar, but hummed steady, like the hum of the fridge in the corner. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of my own boundaries. I wasn't worried about whether standing tall would cost me love. Because love that requires silence isn't love at all. I thought about Rachel, about the long road she has ahead. I can't live her choices for her. But I can live mine. And I can leave behind a legacy that doesn't force her to wash floors at midnight, in silence, for someone else's comfort. I took one last sip of tea, set the mug down gently, and let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. If this hit home, subscribe and tell me your state in the comments. Your story might be next.